Always dangerous.
All right, we are recording to start. Do you mind just clapping up high just so we can sync the audio? Excellent. And then can you tell me your name and your title?
Hasan Davis, Commissioner of the Kentucky Department of Juvenile Justice. Can you give a look at you or?
Look at me and
Okay.
I'll sort of stand sort of here.
All
Excellent. So tell me a bit about the bill.
Well, Senate Bill 200 is the product of 2 years of task force work. The legislature put together a task force on Unified Juvenile Code 2 years ago and tasked us with initially looking at status offense issues, which were starting to come up as a big question every session. And as we got into it over the last 2 years, realized that there was a lot more to it than that. Last year, we got some support from the Pew Charitable Trust to really look deeper than status offenses, start looking at public offenses and how we could do a real transformation of our system. And that was very exciting to me. And so for the last year, we met, took lots of information, had folks from other states that were doing pretty innovative stuff come in, and in December of last year put together recommendations from the task force, and for the last 4 months have been putting together this bill. Last week the Senate did their final concurrence, and so the House and Senate both approved it out, and it's waiting for the governor's signature. What the bill does, it doesn't eliminate status offenders, and for those who don't know, status offenders are young people who have wound up in the system but haven't committed what's a real crime. So if they were an adult doing the same behavior, it would just be bad choices, not a crime. Truancy, not going to work, not going to school, not following a curfew, those types of things. And so we have this whole category of young people who don't commit crimes but wind up in these systems, very often locked in my detention places, and that's unacceptable. And so part of what this bill has done is taken the arbitrary nature of young people coming to the courts with those types of issues and makes it much more difficult for them to wind up in a detention center. So the judge, before a judge can respond to whatever their behavior is, the community has to have a response, looking at assessment, looking at services and support that might help them alleviate whatever the problem is. And then they may come into the court, and still there's a less likelihood they'll come to me. It also prevents young people from staying in my system too long. And so if you're misdemeanors, it allows you to be, even if you wind up committed to us, we get to decide if you ought to be in a facility away from home, or if we can serve you at home with the appropriate services, supports at school, the kind of things that you need to be successful, or if you have to come away from home, that time is very short. I always say that a child coming to us should be rare, it should be brief, and it should be intentional. There should be a specific reason they come to us, and once we address that reason, we should send them home. Just because they curse people out and they get mad and they do those things that teenagers do, those are usually the things that trigger us to extend their stay and say, oh, they need more work. But if they were out of our control, out of our supervision, being a teenager and having a bad attitude and being crusty, that's what I call it, isn't a crime. It's, some kids are jerks, and we have a lot of kids locked up that are just jerks, and they continue to be jerks, and so they wind up with us for 3 years, and the offense that they committed probably should not have had them away from home in the first place, and if so, probably not for more than a couple of months for correction. And so my intention, and what I think the bill does really well, is allows us to ensure that the most expensive services we provide, and it costs upwards of between $90,000 and $100,000 a year to house a child in my facilities. And just a simple cost-benefit analysis, not even talking about the social cost-benefit analysis, but just the economic benefit analysis says that that's unacceptable. With that amount of money, we could provide much more intensive services at home, better supports, and maybe even build family capacity so that whatever happened at that one time doesn't continue to happen until they become adults, and there's a much more dramatic response. And so it's some very exciting things, and with that, it's going to give us the opportunity to be more creative with doing prevention work, with partnering with other agencies, a lot of things that we've been talking about here at the conference this week, to really figure out how all of us do better work to get the outcome we deserve instead of just the outcome that people seem to have come to expect, because imperfect systems have imperfect results.
Well said. That's great. That's great. Can you share, if possible, a sort of personal story of a young person. It can be sort of a, obviously anonymous, and it could be kind of a collage, a creative, fictional version, but of a young person who currently would end up in the system that this bill now will prevent?
I can. And we have lots of young people. I'll just Sarah, who is a runaway, who has experienced abuse, who has experienced neglect on a number of levels, continued to come into our system, actually right here in northern Kentucky. She started in the system, in the family court system, as a dependency and neglect child. There were lots of things going on at home, and the judge was trying to mitigate those circumstances, but Sarah was angry and frustrated, and so began to skip school and started to do all the things that teenagers who are angry and frustrated do. And so what the judge did to teach her a lesson was to sentence her to 5 days in detention. 5 days away from school. Now we have pretty good schools in detention, and the judge says, oh well, I know she's going to go to school in detention, and that's not a good reason to send that child behind a locked door. Well, I know she's going to get good supervision in detention. Well, that's not a good reason to send a child behind locked doors. Well, I know she's going to be safe in detention, but that's not a good reason to send a child behind a locked door. And so all of the reasons, and of course they tell us that we're so great because we provide all these things that a child needs, but they have to be someplace else that can do that better. And so Sarah came in and she did her 5 days in detention, and she had a better attitude, because when you're being told what to do 24 hours a day, it's very easy to get a better attitude. When you don't have any influences from your friend, and you don't have your mom and whatever associations that are at home that are creating the agitation, it's much easier to be a better kid. And as soon as she went home, she started to have troubles again. And in order to, it kind of triggers that fight or flight mentality when you have trauma and you continue to experience that trauma. And so she ran again. And when the judge had her picked up, they sentenced her to 10 more days to teach her a lesson. And this was not acceptable, because the judge told her to do certain things, and because she didn't do what the judge told her to do, there were going to be consequences. And so this continued, and over 3 years, Sarah, who never committed a crime, wound up in our facility for more than 40 days, off and on, small increments, but also continued to interact with young people who ought to be in that facility, even short term, because they had committed much more serious crimes and needed to be held accountable, at least held until they went to court. And so the last time she came into our system, very recently, she came on a criminal charge. And that is the process that we see so often. They start with these dependency and neglect. And so if this bill were in place, Sarah would have never come to us in the first place, because a response team would have done an assessment on her, would have said that there's some things that we need to address. We need to send her to counseling. We need to get the family in and figure out if there are supports we can put in place. And then we need to exhaust all of our available options to ensure that we get the result that Sarah deserves, instead of just the outcome that happens. In imperfect systems that just react instead of respond. And so there may have been a time later down the road that she continued and done something criminal. But until that point, the assumption should be on us that this is a child in need of services, not a child who is delinquent or who needs correction. And I think that on the small scale, that's a huge transformational piece, because keeping the child at home, in community, connected to their relationships, their school, and the places that they do have some value, and building the support for them there, I think creates a better outcome for all of us.
That's fantastic. I'm glad you shared that, and I think that's just really exciting that this will allow a lot more focus on the prevention and the services.
Yes, indeed.
That's great. I have two more quick questions,
Sure.
if you've got time.
Plenty of time, yeah.
Can I Sure. Hi, I'm Patrick Boyle, Communications Director. I work with